This week on Don't Talk TV, I'm going to answer 3 questions that have come up in the comments box. Firstly, I'll give my reaction to the Toronto Police Service arrests at Dundas Square in Queen's Park on February the 13th. Secondly, I'm going to answer whether restricted firearms owners have different rights when it comes to the obligation to answer the door. Thirdly, I'll look into what recourse do members of the public have when they are disturbed by seeing instances of police brutality. Hello, my name's Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and this is Don't Talk TV. In the week since I started this YouTube channel, I've received great response, lots of good questions, lots of very encouraging comments, so I wanted to take an episode to focus on 3 questions that deserved a little bit more in-depth answer than I could give simply in the comments section on YouTube or Facebook. So the first question comes from Sunflower World, and firstly, thank you, Sunflower World, for watching and subscribing, and thank you for the question. So the question is this, quote, could you comment on protesters' arrests at Dundas Square in Queen's Park in Toronto, unquote. Though first I want to take a quick look at the Toronto Police Service news release on this event. So what they say is that on Saturday, February 13th, 2021, the Toronto Police Service monitored and attended several large gatherings, and 5 people were arrested and charged. They then list those individuals, and what we see is a charge of failure to identify, making unnecessary noise on one individual, fail to comply. It's not clear what they're not complying with, but I imagine that person may have been on a probation order or some other order. And then we have a number of obstruct police officers, which I don't know what those are, but they may have been, at least in the police's view, interfering with them attempting to arrest individuals, interfering with them attempting to identify individuals, or it could be something like giving a false name. Now, I tried looking for some video of this, and initially I had a hard time finding it, but Sunflower World recommended that I look up druthers.net on Facebook, so I found the Druthers News and Information Facebook page. And they had some videos. Apparently these are continuously being taken off of YouTube, so I hope this doesn't get my channel cancelled. But I'm just going to show them a little bit here as I give my reaction. And honestly, in terms of police brutality, I don't see police brutality in these videos. What we see here is individuals gathering in contravention of the letter of the law of the Reopening Ontario Act, because you can clearly see there's more than 5 people gathered here, and in fact under the stay-at-home order you're not allowed any outdoor gatherings. And then you see a number of police attempts at police to make arrests. Now it's not clear what police are arresting people for, but I think we can assume they're arresting them because they refuse to identify themselves. The police most likely have legitimate reason to arrest people, again, given what's laid out in the Reopening Ontario Act. And in terms of the arrests themselves, I didn't see any unnecessary use of force. I see individuals who are refusing to put their arms behind their back, people who are offering what's often called passive resistance, where they're going limp and not going with the police, or where the police are having to lift them up off the ground. But I'm not seeing any pistol whippings like in the Barrie police incident, or any punching, or anything excessive. So it's, in fact, frankly, I would say from the video footage I watched, I think TPS acted quite properly in terms of the manner of the arrest. So I think what it's going to come down to on these arrests is not the manner in which the police made the arrests, it's whether the Reopening Ontario Act in itself is a legitimate piece of law, and that the police, and therefore were the police acting in the lawful execution of their duty, was it lawful for them to be arresting people under this act. Now, in arguing that act, there's a number of breaches of the Charter that could be argued, such as arbitrary detention. Confining people to their homes is objectively a detention, and it's arbitrary because it's blanket across everyone, or almost everyone, and then there are certain exceptions, and that may be where the argument of arbitrariness comes in. There could be an argument made that it's cruel and unusual punishment because of the mental health impacts on individuals who are locked in their homes and lose their jobs, not able to see family. Section 2 of the Charter also guarantees freedom of peaceful assembly. Again, I think objectively all of these breaches can be made out. Where the argument would come down is on Section 1 of the Charter and how that applies. And Section 1 reads that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it subject only to such reasonable limits as prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So the argument will be whether these limits on people's rights are reasonable and whether that reasonableness can be demonstrated to justify those restrictions. And there will be a whole host of arguments that could be raised on both sides. Certainly the government would say that they are reasonable restrictions because of the deadliness of this virus, and this is what had to be done in order to prevent that. I think arguments on the other side would require rebuttal medical evidence suggesting that no, this wasn't necessary, or suggesting that the other adverse effects outweigh what was sought to be avoided. The second question came on my Facebook page from a gentleman named Wojciech Simon. And his question was, quote, I own a restricted firearm. Do I have to open the door to let the police to check the restricted firearm? Thank you. End of quote. So again, Wojciech, thank you for watching and thank you for the question. Now, this question was asked several weeks ago. I wanted to look into it a little bit more to make sure that I was fully up to date on the law. This is worthy of a full video in itself, but in brief, the short answer is no, if you only have a single restricted firearm or you don't fall into one of the things that are outlined in Section 102 of the Firearms Act. So just briefly, Section 102 of the Firearms Act says that, subject to Section 104, and for the purpose of ensuring compliance with this act, an inspector may at any reasonable time enter and inspect any place where the inspector believes that there's a business being carried out there, there's a record of a business, or where the inspector reasonably believes that there's a gun collection, or record in relation to a gun collection, or where they believe there's a prohibited firearm, or more than 10 firearms. So there's certain specific instances where these searches can be done. But if you don't have more than 10 firearms, you're not a firearms collector, you're not running a business, or you don't own a prohibited firearm, which, keep in mind, that includes AR-15s now, thanks to the Order in Council last spring, that section would not apply. And of course you have to keep in mind Section 104, which states that reasonable notice has to be given before one of these inspections would occur. Now, I tried to research what exactly is reasonable notice. There don't appear to be any cases that define this, but I think it's safe to say that police or an inspector showing up at your door and immediately demanding to be let in to inspect your firearm would not meet with reasonable notice. Now, there is also Section 105 that allows the police or an inspector to demand that you produce a firearm, but that's different than being required to answer your door, and I'd expect that they'd give you some written notice or a phone call ahead of time. So, in general, there does not appear to be any requirement that simply because you're an owner of a restricted firearm that you have to answer the door to just randomly let police look at your firearms. Now finally, the third question came by email, so I'm not going to mention that individual's name to identify them since it was private, but it was a viewer who was disturbed by last week's video on the Barrie police arrest of Skylar Kent, and this viewer asked, what recourse do members of the public have when they see something like this? Now, there's much more that the individual who's the victim of the violence can do, and a lot less that third parties or other individuals not involved in the situation can do. The person who's charged, I alluded to this in the last video, that they can ask the court to judicially stay or stop the prosecution of their charges because of the violations of their rights. And I outlined some of the violations that I think occurred, or that I would argue occurred. Section 9, arbitrary detention. Section 7, right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Section 13, right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. The victim of this abuse could also file a complaint with the Office of the Independent Police Review Director. Now, another interesting option is that they could file, or even any member of the public could file, a private prosecution. Now, to do a private prosecution, you have to know the name of the officer, know their identity to be able to, in order to have them charged. But any member of the public can swear an information where on reasonable probable grounds they believe that a criminal offense has occurred. And fourthly, there may be civil remedies, although I'm not a civil lawyer, so I can't comment on that specifically, but I suspect that there may be an ability to sue not just the officer, but the police service that employs him or her as well. Again, these comments are not legal advice. You always need specific legal advice tailored to your particular situation. So call me or another lawyer. My 1-855 number is below. I'm always happy to receive calls and answer questions. As I said at the beginning of the video, if you have questions or if there's topics you have in mind that you'd like to see me cover, please leave comments in the comments box. And if you found this video interesting or informative, please consider liking or subscribing.